But first of all, let's talk a little bit about the Old Testament preparations for the gift of the Holy Spirit that comes in the New Testament. If we enter into the New Testament without having some knowledge of the Old Testament, it's like walking into a conversation in the middle of it between two people, and we don't know what they're talking about because we haven't been there since the beginning of the conversation. Well, if we look at the Old Testament, what do we see? We see many images of the Spirit of God in the Old Testament. There are two major dimensions that the Holy Spirit, or simply the Spirit of God, is expressed in the Old Testament. One is the Spirit of life. The other is the Spirit of surprise. And then we might add a third one by way of a P.S., if you will, the Spirit of wisdom. In the Spirit of life, we see from the earliest pages of the book of Genesis, when God creates the first human being. This text says that God took the slime of the earth, or the mud of the earth, or the clay of the earth, and breathed into it the breath of life. So the Spirit appears as breath, first of all. But sin can lose this breath, and people can go back to death and to the soil from which they were taken. The Book of Wisdom tells us that the breath of life is on loan to us. And then finally, of course, this image of the Spirit as life, as the breath of life, is picked up by the evangelist John. But the Spirit is also surprise in the Old Testament. And that is the Spirit that comes upon the prophets, or perhaps upon certain heroes in the book of Judges, so that they can do amazing things like Samson. But this spirit of prophecy is given so that these judges can govern wisely. Wise leaders need the prophetic spirit. And this prophetic spirit is promised especially to the Messiah in Isaiah chapter 11, verse 1 to 11, where the Spirit is described as coming upon the future king. And of course, this scene anticipates the Christian Pentecost in several ways. In the New Testament, the Spirit as surprised is picked up especially by St. Luke, who looks at the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, especially from the viewpoint of the surprising action, the prophetic spirit, in the Gospel of Luke and in the Acts of the Apostles. Finally, in the Old Testament, the Spirit is the Spirit of wisdom. We see that particularly in the story of Joseph, toward the end of the book of Genesis, where Joseph is especially endowed with a spirit of wisdom to interpret dreams and so on. But wisdom also in the book of Proverbs, in chapter 1, verse 23, is said to pour out her own spirit. And that is a bit of a surprise already in the Old Testament, because up to this point in the prophets, it's the Spirit of God that comes upon the prophet to say his prophecy or to do the wonders that the Lord has given him to do. But the prophet never pours out his own spirit, but the Spirit of wisdom, which is basically identified with God as one of the attributes of God, the Spirit of wisdom, portrayed as a woman, pours out her own spirit. Well, let's turn now to the New Testament. Now, where do we begin in the New Testament? Well, we could take the chronological order of the writings, and if we did that, then we would start with the first letter to the Thessalonians, which is the very first letter of the Christian literature, written about 51 AD. And we could start with that and then move on with the other letters of Paul. All the letters of Paul, or practically all of them, were written before the Gospels. Or we could take the chronological order of the events, and if that is the case, we would start with the Gospels, with the life of Jesus. Now, in my book, The Holy Spirit, Growth of a Biblical Tradition, I start from the first pages of the Old Testament and go all the way down to the Apocalypse, and I take each document in its chronological order. But for our sake here, we will start with the Gospel of Mark. Now,